They thought they could silence him, strip away his land, and bury years of family history under a pile of concrete. But when the fight reached the courtroom, every whisper stopped and every eye widened. Because the last person they ever expected to see walk in was the one man who could change everything. His own brother, sitting in the judge's chair. The story begins with a man who had grown up cherishing a small cabin tucked away in the woods. It wasn't just any property. The cabin was built decades earlier by his late father, with his own hands, piece by piece, as a place of rest, retreat, and memory. For the narrator, that cabin wasn't only timber and nails. It was a symbol of family, legacy, and the bloodline he belonged to. Every corner carried stories. Every board carried the weight of the past. But then came the HOA. Like many modern homeowner associations, this particular one had grown more controlling with time. What started as a group meant to maintain order had slowly turned into a governing body that seemed more interested in power than in community. And at the heart of it was one woman who acted like the self-appointed sheriff of the neighborhood, Karen. People didn't even need her last name anymore. Her reputation traveled ahead of her. She had interfered in yard decorations, fined families for parking in their own driveways, and even forced one neighbor to tear down a shed because she claimed it didn't match the neighborhood's aesthetic. So, when her eyes landed on the cabin, it became her next target. Karen insisted the cabin was a violation. She argued that it wasn't up to code, that it didn't align with the development's image, and even accused it of lowering property values. None of that was true. The cabin had been standing long before the HOA ever existed. But Karen didn't care about history or fairness. She wanted control. And in her mind, the cabin had to go. The narrator received a letter, cold and calculated, warning him that the HOA would take legal action if he refused to demolish the cabin himself. He was shocked. How could anyone claim authority over something his family had owned long before the HOA even had power in the area? He tried to reason with them, presenting documentation that proved the cabin was lawful and legally registered as part of his property. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. She saw resistance as a challenge, and she wasn't about to lose. Then came the moment that turned outrage into devastation. Karen managed to push the HOA board into hiring a contractor. One morning, heavy machinery appeared on the path leading toward the cabin. A bulldozer stood there like a weapon, its engine rumbling. They were prepared to flatten the place that carried his father's fingerprints and his childhood memories. But the narrator was not about to let them. He rushed out, documents in hand, and confronted the crew. The contractor hesitated. He didn't want to be caught in legal trouble. So, for the moment, the bulldozer stopped. But Karen was furious. She shouted that she'd have the law on her side, that he'd be forced to pay fines, that he couldn't stand in the way of the HOA forever. And so, the battle moved to court. The narrator braced himself. He knew these cases could drag on, and he wasn't wealthy. The HOA had money, lawyers, and influence. He had memories and truth. But sometimes truth alone isn't enough. As the trial date approached, Karen carried herself with smug confidence. She told neighbors that the cabin would soon be rubble. She even laughed at the idea of him defending himself, whispering that he didn't stand a chance against the HOA's legal team. And to be fair, the odds did look stacked. But life has a way of turning tables. The narrator had mentioned his situation to his family, and though they supported him, one particular family member stayed quiet, his brother. People didn't know much about his brother because he lived in another part of the state, working quietly in his career. What most people didn't realize, especially Karen, was that his brother wasn't just working any job. He had risen in the legal world with a reputation for fairness and integrity. He had become a judge. The narrator didn't ask for favors. He didn't even think his brother would ever be assigned to his case. But fate doesn't ask permission. On the morning of the hearing, The narrator walked into the courtroom, nerves rattling, knowing Karen and her lawyers were armed with binders of arguments. Then the judge's door opened. The room fell silent, because the man who walked in, robed and steady, carrying the authority of the law, was none other than his own brother. Karen's smirk froze. The HOA's attorneys exchanged glances, and the narrator himself nearly lost his breath. The one man he trusted most, the one man who had known their family struggles, their values, and the truth about the cabin, was now sitting on the bench with the gavel in hand. Now, this wasn't about family favoritism. His brother was known for being fair above all else. But fairness was exactly what Karen had been trying to avoid. The hearing began. Karen's side argued loudly, waving paperwork and citing codes that didn't even apply. They painted the cabin as an eyesore, a danger, a liability. They spoke as if they were saving the community by tearing it down. Then it was the narrator's turn. Calmly, he laid out the history of the cabin. He presented the original property deeds, showing the cabin existed before the HOA was ever established. He highlighted the preservation laws protecting historical family structures. He explained that the cabin wasn't just a structure. It was a legal part of his inheritance. His brother listened without interrupting, his face unreadable but focused. When Karen tried to interject with insults and accusations, the judge cut her off, reminding her this was a courtroom, not her HOA meeting. Piece by piece, the HOA's case unraveled. Their claims didn't hold water against the documented truth. Their so-called evidence was exposed as assumptions, exaggerations, and misinterpretations. And finally, when the time came for a ruling, the judge, his brother, delivered the words that shook the entire room. The HOA had no authority over the cabin. Their attempt to bulldoze it was unlawful. The narrator had full rights to keep, maintain, and preserve the property. Furthermore, the HOA was warned against further harassment or attempts to seize what didn't belong to them. Karen's face burned with rage. The courtroom, filled with community members who had grown tired of her tactics, buzzed with murmurs. Some even smiled, relieved to see justice finally prevail. And as for the narrator, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The cabin was safe. His father's legacy was intact. But more than that, the victory carried a deeper message. Bullies lose when truth has a platform, and power crumbles when fairness stands in its path. Karen stormed out, furious and humiliated. The HOA lawyers packed their files with stiff silence, and the narrator walked away knowing his battle had not only saved a cabin, it had exposed the limits of control. For the rest of the neighborhood, that day marked a shift. Karen wasn't as bold anymore. People whispered less about her authority and more about her defeat. And every time the narrator visited the cabin, he didn't just see wood and walls. He saw a reminder that standing up matters, that justice finds a way, and that sometimes, when least expected, the person holding the gavel is family.